From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
I had my degree in economics. I wasn't using my degree. I wasn't interested in finance, but I was definitely interested in nature, and it started to occur to me that I wanted my life and my legacy to be about, better understanding the environment, how we can protect it, how we can be better stewards of it.
I think I've mentioned before that I have a side gig as an adjunct communications professor at Salisbury University in Maryland. I typically teach 100 and 200 level courses, so my students tend to be freshmen and sophomores. On the first day of every semester, I go around the room and have each student state their name, major, and what kinds of jobs they want to pursue. I don't keep formal stats on this, but there's always a good percentage of students who declare themselves uncertain on the career question. In a class of 20 or so students, I can usually count on at least 4 or 5 who just don't know yet. If you're a younger person listening to this, and you don't know yet either, take heart. You're not alone. First-year college students are increasingly undecided about their intended college major. In 1966, a little under 2% of students ticked the undecided box. By 2015, about 9% were unsure. And this is just a tiny fraction of the true picture of indecision. It's estimated that 75% of college students will change their major at least once. And what about after you graduate? How many recent graduates actually work in a field related to their major? Well, I found a range of percentages on this from different sources. I've seen figures that say as little as 27% of grads got jobs that closely match their major. I've seen 46%. Suffice it to say, it looks like there's no guarantee that you'll stay in the same field after you get your diploma. My guest today just might be the epitome of figuring things out later in life, and how there's no time limit on success. If you're in need of a dose of career inspiration, well, just stay tuned. Welcome to Season 3 of Chesapeake Uncharted. This time, our team here at the Bay Journal is interested in hearing from a younger generation of Bay leaders, the people who weren't born when the Chesapeake Bay cleanup formally began 40 years ago. With the Bay restoration effort facing its current set of cleanup goals in 2025, this felt like a good time to go searching for some inspiration. Each episode spotlights one of these wave makers. Today, our guest is Ron Lopez. At 40 years old, Lopez just makes it under the age bar to be among this podcast's wave makers. But there's no denying he is making a big impact in his field. He is a faculty research associate at Virginia Commonwealth University, based at the Rice River Center in Charles City. In less than 10 years in academia, he has already added much to our collective knowledge about freshwater tidal forest dynamics and using remote sensing to detect harmful algae blooms. But his journey has also included working as a bartender, a marketing representative, and a drywall hanger, among other vocations. He has seen much and done much. More about Ron Lopez after this quick break.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Hello again. On today's episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're talking with Ron Lopez, a researcher in wetlands ecology at VCU, who is part of teams breaking ground on our understanding of low-lying forests and algae blooms in the Shenandoah River. His efforts toward developing new methods to map those potentially toxic blooms are the basis of his ongoing doctoral thesis. So yes, we get to talk about drones. But there are very real-world implications for that work. Beginning in 2010, carpets of greenish algae began plaguing more than 50 miles of the Shenandoah's North Fork. This is a major tributary of the Potomac River, which flows into the Chesapeake Bay, so the bad things that happen here also bode ill for the bay. The blooms tend to explode in the summer and early fall. They involve a species of blue-green algae called cyanobacteria, one of the most ancient organisms on the planet. Some types are toxic. In humans, they can cause rashes if touched, and gastrointestinal distress if swallowed. In smaller animals, such as dogs, they can be fatal. The cause probably has to do something with excess nutrients from agriculture and from wastewater treatment plants, but the exact sources in the Shenandoah region remain unknown, and the current water sampling regime used to detect the blooms is too sporadic to give the public much warning about where the blooms are and where they're heading. Ron can fill a lot of tape talking about his life and his research, so let's get rolling. Well, Ron Lopez, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. I'm happy to be talking to you.
All right, so you are a researcher there at Virginia Commonwealth University, but you are not on the main campus. Tell us about what you do there.
So I work at the VCU Rice River Center, which is our ecological and biological field station out on the James River. We do a lot of research from fisheries science, wetland ecology, to atmospheric science, all the way to the intersection of human health and environmental health. So we cover sort of a broad range, and it's been the Rice River Center since I got my master's has been definitely a big part of my life. You know, I was fortunate to have done my master's research there, and then subsequently was hired as faculty. Right now, my roles there are as a wetland ecologist, which is my background, and a remote sensing scientist, which is a lot of what I do currently.
And you are in the throes of pursuing your PhD, right?
Correct. Was kind of fortunate to have been given a faculty position with my master's pretty much as soon as I graduated. So I'd been working with my master's for a few years and recently decided to get my terminal degree. And I'm in my I just finished my second semester, actually.
Let's start from the start. You said you're from Lexington, Virginia. What was it like growing up there?
Lexington is an incredible place to grow up. I mean, it's tucked into the Shenandoah Valley, really pretty. You're surrounded by nature. And, I would say there's like not a lot to do in Lexington as far as, nightlife and that sort of thing for people that are a little bit older. But as a kid, it was sort of an ideal place to grow up. And for me, I was always outside hiking and playing in the woods. So it was a pretty special place for me to grow up.
I always ask people where their love for the environment began. Is that the genesis of your story there?
My friends and I were always out in the woods. So there was no need to foster an appreciation for nature like later in life. Like I've always sort of been immersed in it and loved it, and it's sort of just been the biggest part of my my formative years, I guess, was being outside. And
yet you go to college at and I admitted admitted to you before, I'd never heard of this until today, but the oldest private college in the South, Hampton-Sydney College, which at the time was an all-men's school, and you studied economics there. What was your thinking there with that degree?
To be perfectly honest, it was at that point in my life, and I think like a lot of young people, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, when I grew up. It was, don't know what you want to do, go into finance, you'll make good money. So the economics degree, that was sort of the impetus there. I enjoyed economics, but I was never really interested in finance. I knew that pretty early on. So yeah, I finished my degree, but it took a little bit for me to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life.
You teach higher level courses, maybe don't get that as much, but I don't know. What do you say to students who are, maybe undergrads who are still trying to figure themselves out?
I encourage it 100% to take time, to, figuring out what you want to do with your life. I think comes with a little bit of life experience. And for some, I don't want to generalize for everybody, but for me, it took life experience to figure out, what it is that I liked, what I didn't like to do, what were my values. It wasn't as, an 18-year-old kid, like I had no idea. So I totally encourage students to explore who they are and what their values are, generated by their own experiences.
Now, I know the term gap year refers to that year between, high school and college, but I'm going to use it to apply to between college and leaving college and entering the real world. You took a gap 7 years. Can you help us understand what were you doing during that time?
Yeah, my gap year. So I went out as soon as I finished, and it was actually before I finished my undergraduate degree. I knew that I wanted to go west or go someplace. I wanted to explore a little bit, right? So for me, and I've always been a big skier, so I wanted to go to Wyoming. So I went to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I made that my home base. It was only supposed to be really a gap year. It was supposed to be like for a year, But I ended up staying out there for 7 years and kind of exploring the West, driving around, seeing things, experiencing things. Super, super cool part of my life. And I wouldn't take it back for anything in the world, You've had a lot of different jobs on your resume. Can you kind of give us a quick overview of some of the things you've done to make ends meet over the years? Oh, yeah. Tons of stuff. I mean, when I was out there, it was everything from painting houses to waiting tables to bartending. I'm sure odd jobs, hanging drywall, kind of whatever it took. But it was all about when I could, I was trying to work at night so I could be outside during the day. And that's how I worked it, I had sort of a great setup out there where I had a cabin up in the mountains and I could just kind of take off when I wanted. And so a lot of the jobs were like bartending. You get somebody to cover your shifts for a week and you go someplace. So you made good money and you had a lot of flexibility. So it was kind of all about that. Once I got back to, once I decided I wanted to go back to school, Virginia made a lot of sense because I'm from Virginia. I had some friends there, places to live while I figured things out. I knew VCU was a good school. So I came back, and when I started, I had a job with Cisco Foods for a while as a marketing representative. I had a job. I was working briefly while I started my graduate degree. I was working 3 jobs, I think. I was working at a convenience store, a corner market. I was bartending, and I was selling ad space for RVA Magazine for a little bit.
Where'd your parents come from?
So my father was born in Cuba. My mother was born in Italy.
So I love that you, in the first acknowledgement on your master's thesis, you thanked your mother, Bernadette, for her inexhaustible love. I don't think it's required that you thank your mom there. Why did you want to do that?
My mother, all my life has been extremely supportive of everything that I do or decide to do. Like, yes, she wanted me to be successful. She was very happy with me going, to Hampton-Sydney and getting a degree in economics, and probably figured I'd go into finance and be what you might call traditionally successful, monetarily. Obviously, then I go to Wyoming and I just don't come back. She was incredibly supportive of me having those experiences that made me the person who I am today. And then when I decided to come back to school and go into a career, completely switch gears from like the finance route to, let's face it, in our field, like they're not like, these aren't jobs that you take to get wealthy. But nonetheless, like no matter what my choices were, she was there to support me.
Digging in a little deeper here on your master's thesis, you were looking into tidal forests there along the James River in the vicinity around the Rice River Center, and looking at whether or not the platform there, the land level, could keep pace with relative sea level rise. Obviously, the seas are going up, and the land is sinking in our area from various causes. What did you find there?
And I'm super glad that you brought up the part that the land is sinking, because there's oddly like so many studies that look at wetland response to sea level rise that don't take into account subsidence signatures, But yeah, my master's thesis was all about tidal freshwater forested wetland response to rising water levels. And like super important because like our systems, like these tidal freshwater systems, are really underrepresented in the literature. We installed a series of benchmarks around the wetlands, Cambridges Creek and Harris Creek, at the Rice River Center, Presqu'Île, and James River National Wildlife Refuges. We had 18 benchmarks in total that allowed us to look at, elevation change at the surface and accretion of sediment and subsidence. And if you do that over time, you could generate trends, right? Like of elevation change over time, of a rate of change. What we found in our location was that the rate of elevation change at the surface was around or just over the rate of local relative sea level rise. So our wetlands are kind of doing what you would want them to do. They're sort of keeping pace.
I'm kind of more familiar with the wetlands side of our tidal marshes. How does a freshwater tidal forest build up its surface then, or increase elevation anyway?
You still have like the trapping of tidal sediment, incoming tidal sediment to build up vertical accretion. One of the areas where a tidal forest has, can also build up sediment or build up, vertical elevation is tidal forests, of course, are full of trees, bald cypress and tupelo and green ash and all these wetland trees. They have the root structures themselves as they grow can build up surface elevation themselves. A lot of it is the root structure actually growing.
So the takeaway here is that we have some hope then for these forested wetland areas?
In our location, it seems like the tidal forests in our area, yes, are keeping pace reasonably well. But it doesn't take, like, again, you go just a little bit east of here to the epicenter and things can change somewhat dramatically. So really what we just need is more research being done at a variety of sites around Delmarva and Chesapeake Bay, so that we could start to generalize or start to see, or have a better idea of what the elevation change dynamics are going to be.
And so here you are, you're emerging from your master's degree, moving into your work as a researcher there, and you're not content with just being the sediment guy. You've moved into imaging and satellites and drones. How did all that come about?
As I mentioned before, I was fortunate to get hired as faculty at the Rice River Center right after I finished my master's. So I started doing work out there, and I had the opportunity to. There was a guy named Will Stewart who now works primarily for the Army Corps of Engineers, but he still works kind of part-time for the Rice Center. He does a lot of remote sensing. He's been doing it for like 20 years. So I got to work with him some and sort of learn about how to do remote sensing, but also all of the applications. It's this incredible tool. And when we talk about like ecological research, there's always, geospatial component. There's always a spatial component that's part of the story. So remote sensing by its nature is a tool that can kind of capture those large spatial elements and is an incredibly effective way of answering questions related, ecological questions. So I became fascinated with remote sensing really quickly.
Now, remote sensing, that's kind of a catch-all term. What kind of tools are you talking about here?
Yeah, so like remote sensing is just, it's studying anything without directly contacting it, basically. But what I'm specifically talking about is using two types of remote sensing: active sensing and passive remote sensing. Active remote sensing is, you're emitting some kind of signature and measuring the response from, whatever target on the ground. That would be like LiDAR, light detection and ranging. And then passive is where you're using, sensors that are measuring actual solar electromagnetic energy, whatever target on Earth's surface is responding to solar energy.
And this work has brought you back home, the Shenandoah region, right?
Yeah. That was just sort of it was a convenient twist of fate, call it. The Shenandoah has been experiencing these benthic cyanobacterial blooms since at least like the early 2010s. There have been reports of these benthic cyanobacterial blooms. And 2021, I believe, is when the DEQ, did some investigations and found these cyanobacterial blooms were producing toxins. We at the VCU Rice River Center actually confirmed the presence of antitoxin A and microcystin in samples from 2022 in the system. So, all this is happening, and they're doing these advisories and closures on the Shenandoah River. And so there was an opportunity within the Virginia Hab Task Force to do some work out on the Shenandoah with remote sensing, basically to test the efficacy of hyperspectral imaging for the detection and quantification of these cyanobacterial blooms.
Taking a step back here, these terms, microcystin, cyanobacteria, they sound bad. Why are they bad?
Right, so cyanobacteria are actually the Earth's oldest photosynthetic organisms.
They're known as blue-green algae, right?
Correct, blue-green algae. And I think most people in this area in Virginia, like they've always tended to think of microcystis. They tend to be in the water column. What we're seeing in the Shenandoah are these colonial blue-green algae that are benthic. They're growing on substrate in the Shenandoah. And that's sort of like the first, this has been pretty well documented around the rest of the country. But in Virginia, these benthic freshwater rivers having these benthic cyanobacterial colonies, this is sort of like the first time it's really been documented in the Shenandoah. So it's sort of an interesting occurrence that's starting to happen there. These cyanobacteria are capable of, in some instances, producing toxins. And some of them can be, you have neurotoxins and hepatotoxins, and some of them can be quite dangerous. You have dangerous to animals, dangerous to humans.
Like just to touch it, or is it just a drinking issue, or?
It can be touching, it could be drinking, it could be, in some cases, breathing. And in some cases, you'll have, like if you eat seafood, for example, like toxic shellfish poisoning, you can get sick by eating seafood that have kind of been inoculated with these toxins.
And help people understand, these look pretty gnarly, right? When you get the blooms, like big slimy mats of green on the water, right?
Yeah, you can have like those mat-forming cyanobacteria. What we see in the Shenandoah is again, these are like kind of these benthic forms, right? Because the river's moving constantly, in some case, very strong current. So you have these benthic forms that are, sheltering, like they're growing on rocks on the bottom of the river, or they're growing on substrate, they're growing on leaf litter, all these different places.
Well, as we said, we can see these mats with the naked eye. Why bring remote sensing into this then?
If you're trying to assess a bloom occurring on a large stretch of rivers, for example, the North Fork of the Shenandoah, and there's the spatial component, there's farms and development, there's wastewater treatment plants, they're all around the river. One question is, how do you really go about assessing, where are the blooms sort of hottest? Where are those hot spots on the river and when? when are those occurring? It can be very difficult to assess that by taking point measurements in the field. If you're just going out and taking samples of algae here and there. First, access to the river can be challenging. Navigation in the river itself can be really challenging. There's a current. And you can be very close to a place where there's a large, dense cyanobacterial bloom and not even realize it. You might be kind of sampling in kind of the wrong place and have no idea. When you're out there, when you're collecting data over a large spatial scale and high spatial temporal resolution with remote sensing, say with a drone or a plane flying over with a hyperspectral imager, then you can start to get a better idea of the spatial temporal patterning of the bloom.
Hyperspectral meaning beyond what the human eye can see?
If you've ever done shown light through a prism, right, and had it diffracted into the visible spectrum, right? Do you remember ever doing that in like a high school or middle school science class?
I was lucky enough, yes.
Yes, so like if you diffract light, you can see all the visible wavelengths. Well, we essentially have these imagers that can split the visible spectrum in the near infrared into hundreds of individual wave bands. And if you were to essentially, if you put we put an imager like this on a drone, we fly it over the system, and it creates a map.
Okay, so you're out there physically flying a drone over the river.
For this study in the Shenandoah, we're actually, and it's all, this study is developing models that can estimate cyanobacteria and testing how good they are at doing it. So we're validating the models with actually ground truth measurements we're taking on the ground, right? We're collecting ground truth data. We'll grab samples of the cyanobacteria. We'll know exactly where they are in the pixels because we're GPSing those locations with high precision GPS. And then we're quantifying the amount of pigments of interest.
What will it mean to have this ability to detect cyanobacteria blooms from afar?
The first thing is having when we are able to, from remote sensing reflectance, model cyanobacterial biomass, then you have these concentration maps that can be used for further analyses, right? For understanding, what are the drivers of the bloom? So that's sort of like a longer term thing. These products can be used for further analysis. The more immediate thing is that this tool, these models that we're working on, can work as an early warning system. They can start to quantify, how much cyanobacteria, how much of how much cyanobacterial biomass is in the water and in what locations. And it can do that quicker than we can go out and point measure. It's a very rapid turnaround time.
I'm curious what all my guests have to say about the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, particularly as we get into this pivot year of 2025 and the expiration of the current agreement and the writing of the new agreement, setting forth the new way forward. Do you have any thoughts on how to better get at restoring this very complicated watershed?
For me, and I think the program does great work as it stands, but for me, I think that the best way to continue to collect good data on which to make decisions is to partner with agencies and academia that can go out and do the work. For me, what I would really like to see is increased partnership with academic institutions. I think grants, specifically grant opportunities that are focused on the hiring of student researchers to do the work are really helpful to universities and programs like the Rice River Center. Those allow us, they get rid of a lot of the overhead costs. Basically, we have when we're hiring student researchers, we have minimal overhead. We can do more work with the money that is granted. And it also provides educational opportunities for the students that we're involving, right? So it's sort of like a win-win-win, in my opinion.
Well, Ron, this has been really, really great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jeremy. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at bayjournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.